So, one of the most important things we need to understand to be good spellers and good teachers of spelling is that we have essentially 4 spelling knowledges. And sometimes we use these in different ways in our curriculums, and sometimes we name them different things. But I'm going to give you the linguistic approach, and I'm going to show you how we can use them to understand that words actually do make sense and their spelling makes sense. So we have 4 spelling knowledges. The first one is, I guess the best way to think of them is our avenues of understanding how word spelling makes sense. And these are kind of, I like to think of them as lenses that we have to look through in order to see the sense behind a spelling of a word. So our first knowledge is our phonological knowledge. So that's our understanding of the sounds that belong and don't belong in our language, and the sounds, how they might combine, in what order we can put them. And the wonderful thing about phonology is that we develop it naturally. We acquire it. It's what our brains are built to do. So we, as babies, we collect all this data from the world and we say, oh, yep, that belongs to my language. This doesn't belong to my language. And children actually come to school with an implicit understanding of phonology. The challenge is to make that knowledge explicit. So we want phonological awareness. We want them to be conscious of the movement that's happening in their mouth, of the sounds that they're hearing and how they're processing them. So that's really important. And some of the hurdles that we come across is, how do we deal with different accents? Well, I kind of say it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you're an Australian teacher teaching in America. Actually, I think it's a really great strength because it draws more attention to the difference in our phonology, for example. So it leads us to have some really good discussions about the sounds of our language. Orthography is what some curriculums call visual knowledge. But while spelling is obviously a visual process to an extent, it's about capturing something in a visual form, it's not visual knowledge that we're using. Orthography means ortho, means correct, graphic means writing. So it's about the correct writing system. So there are certain rules about how we put letters together in English that don't apply in other languages. There's certain rules about how we put parts of words together, so morphemes and how we add suffixes, for example. So I like to think of this crossover point here between phonology and orthography. This is really our phonics, but it's not just about how sounds are represented by letters. It's about how sounds are represented by letters, but also patterns that exist and what things are allowed next to each other and how certain sounds might influence each other. So we're going to work through all of those in these videos. But orthography is certain things like, and I'll talk about this in greater depth another time, but for example, in English, when you hear the v sound, like for Veronica, at the end of a word, the V is never by itself. It's an old scribal habit. Before we had typing, it was a convention to put the letter E with the V at the end of a word so we would not mistake the V for a U, for example. So when you hear the V sound, like in have and give and love, for example, there has to be an E because there's a V at the end and we can't leave it on its own. Okay, so that's what we like to call a rule, but I like to call them conventions because I would like to move away from the idea of rules. The next kind of lens that we need to overlay for many words is a morphological lens. So we have to understand, are there meaningful parts in this word and how are they being put together? Because once we start to add suffixes and prefixes, the way we pronounce things changes. The wonderful thing about morphemes, which are the meaningful parts, so like ed for past tense, for example, is that they don't change. They might sound slightly different sometimes, but the spelling is always really consistent. So this introduces the idea that we have to think about the meaning of the word just as much as the sounds of the word. And that's probably something that we don't impress upon enough in our children when we're scaffolding the spelling process. So really understanding what the word means is important. I've come across many classrooms and many students that are learning to spell words that they don't understand what they mean. Firstly, what's the point? Because they're not going to use those words if they don't know the meaning. But secondly, we're taking away a very important part of the spelling process. So meaning really is important. And the last bit, which is the really fun bit, the last bit of knowledge is the etymological knowledge. And we tend to think of etymology. So etymology actually means, etim means true meaning. So this is the study of true meaning. Etymology, we usually think of, oh, that's something that, our 5th and 6th graders do. It's about Greek and Latin roots. But etymology comes into play very, very early in school because etymology is the explanation of some of the weirdness in our language, and it explains how certain words are connected through their meaning. Okay, and we'll work through some examples of those. I like to think of etymology as like either an archaeologist digging for the bones of the meaning in a word, or the narrative. So every word has a story behind it. We don't necessarily have to know the story of every word. Like we don't need to know the story of the word cat or dog to be able to spell it correctly. But there's many words that we have to know the meaning and the connection to history to spell it correctly. So for example, the word sign, like I sign something, has to have a G in there because it's etymologically connected to signature and signal. And the wonderful thing, like I said, about morphology and now etymology is that those little markers, even though we can't hear them sometimes, they're still there. So try to think about spelling as making meaning and communicating sense as opposed to just representing our spoken language. And suddenly things start to make sense. Now, I wanted to show you this little analogy here. I like to think of phonics as our gateway to the city. So it's essential, okay? If you don't open the gates and you don't understand that language is our sound represented in writing to a certain extent, then it's very difficult to start a conversation about spelling. And in terms of scaffolding from younger students and lower ability to higher, we want them to always be paying attention to what they're doing with their mouth and what they're hearing. And then thinking about, well, what do I know about the language to be able to spell it correctly? Here we have where kind of orthography and morphology crossover. So this is like your suffixes. This is like your signage and road rules. These are what's allowed, what's not. This is like your stop and think. What do you need to do to join these two bits together? Where morphology and etymology kind of cross over, that's like your highway network. So they're all the amazing networks in our brains of how words are connected to one another. So things like sign being related to signal, for example, or the word friend is connected by a highway to the word Friday, which I'll talk about in our high frequency word lessons. And up here, etymology explains why things change. Okay, there is a story to our English language and things do change over time, but particularly the way we say things. So actually, it's not spelling's fault. It's that we keep changing the way we say things, but the spelling stays the same. So then we look at it and we think, well, that's a bit odd, but it's actually our fault to begin with. So I hope this little analogy helps you. So you have to open the gateway, you have to follow the road rules, you get around on this highway network, and there's always little shortcuts and road changes that you need to be aware of in order to get from A to B. So I hope that you are getting excited about learning about spelling.